Hello and welcome. Welcome to MetaCulture Studio. Everybody today that runs a show, everyone who runs an interview platform, everyone who is on YouTube or, trying to interview people talks about their platform being unique and different. So I'm kind of stumped. I don't quite know how to characterize MetaCulture Studio without falling into the usual cliches. So I'm merely going to tell you what we are trying to do. MetaCulture Studio is an attempt at having serious and informal conversations with sincere thinkers. I say sincere thinkers because I'm not interested in inviting experts who can talk endlessly about their areas of expertise. I'm not interested in inviting passionate activists who want to tell us how to lead our lives. Here, I invite sincere, generous, warm hearted people who are genuinely interested in exploring ideas, exploring with a view to improving not only the audience's understanding, but mine as the host. And I'm hoping that they will also learn in the process. It's, to use another cliche, I can't seem to escape them, a learning conversation. So, welcome again. My guest today, Dr. Champaka Rajagopal, is someone I've known for a few decades now, even though she's way younger than me. And I'm excited to have her here. And rather than my trying to explain who she is, Champaka, why don't you tell those of us who are here who you are?
Thank you very much, Ashok. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Who am I? Well, that question takes me back to 1993 when I first met you. And you were um, running this set of sessions where we would discuss it. It was called The Alternatives, if you remember, where we would explore with a group of people are very diverse responses to a whole range of situations. And the one big takeaway for me from that experience was that I should never box myself up into one straitjacketed identity. So that's been with me ever since, I must say that. So if you say I must introduce myself, then I would say I'm a passionate thinker. And I'm someone who's very interested to learn, and I pay a lot of attention to nuances and questions that have stayed with me for 20, 30 years, for instance. So that's how I would like to see myself. But having said that, I am also a domain expert. I'm an urban planner, and I'm passionate about cities. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I'll have to sort of pull myself out of my domain expertise and enter this sort of an uncomfortable space of having a non-academic, non expertise oriented discussions today with you. So looking forward to that.
I apologize for having to dumb you down, but that's at one level. It's kind of like rather than dumbing ourselves down to make ourselves more reflective, deeper, and open about the things we already know. So thank you again. And you're going back to 1993. My past is coming to haunt me again, in a way. So, but those were very interesting times. And I don't want to dwell nostalgically on the kind of work I was doing in Bangalore more than 30 years ago. But there is a sense of a full circle. Those were very interesting times because and I'll speak for myself, like many others, I took living in a democratic state for granted. I took my freedoms for granted. And my passion and my energies went in terms of trying to extend my freedoms, extend the rights that we had, and to find ways to help people maximize their intelligence, their communicative capabilities, and the depth. And we are in a very different place now. And this is where I I'm really excited about our conversation today, Champaka, because you are an urban planner, but I know you're being very modest about this, but for the last 15 years, you and I have had many useful conversations about public planning processes, about collaborative consultation, about consensus building. And more than anyone else I know, except for professional consensus building folk who do nothing else, you are one person who has experienced on the ground attempts at consultation between competing stakeholders, between government, between government and businesses, between the competing stakeholders within a city. And
Yeah.
I know that, we have both in our own ways wondered how those processes could be better. So let me invite you to share with us whatever you want to about your experience within this area of public processes, and just your experience. And you feel free to tell us that it happened in Mumbai or in Tripoli, in Libya, or wherever. Be as candid as your NDAs will allow you to be.
Most certainly, yeah. There are so many reflections and memories, and I think for me, I'm not a public participation expert, so to say, but I think what would be really useful, Ashok, is to situate ourselves in the current moment. I think there cannot be anything more relevant than that, and many of our discussions are actually centered around the current moment and the years that we've engaged with one another. And one question that sort of really comes to my mind, and I've really struggled with it actually over the last 2 years, in this time and space of the pandemic, and considering that I'm an urban planner, you can't plan for uncertainty, right? So what is planning in this kind of a context? And if you can't plan for uncertainty, then where do we situate democracy in this kind of a context where planning processes that I've been advocating in the past are all anchored on participatory processes, right? And we work in large teams. But participatory processes take time. It consumes a lot of effort. There's so much coordination that goes into all of that. And I'm really struggling with where do we find the space for democracy in a context where the virus is so rapidly moving?
Right. This reminds me of of an anecdote I normally uh, share with both clients as well as students, which is that if my house is on fire, I don't gather my family together and my neighbors and consult with them about what needs to be done. If my house is on fire, I either call 911 or immediately start looking for water or something to douse the fire. In a time of crisis, you do not engage in elaborate, complex, and time consuming discussion. It is anti survival. Okay, so let's be very clear about it. There's a time for deliberation, there's a time for consensus, and there's a time for action. When your house is burning, and a virus is very often a situation like that. As the pandemic is escalating, yes, you probably need to get a group of experts together, but you don't go to a village in Bihar or Wyoming, a little town in Wyoming, and get all the people together in the town hall to ask what needs to be done. This is why we have central governments, federal governments. It is the primary responsibility of a government to protect its people. So that's the same is true in times of war. When India was attacked by China or in the Bangladesh liberation struggle, that's not where you do public participation. The kind of participation you do there is, and people like Mrs. Gandhi did it during the 71 war, they brought the opposition to the table. The opposition represented large sections of the population, and that's how consensus happened. But people, I was very young, but my teachers, my parents, they were not consulted. So to say that that is in a time of crisis, consensus building is probably not a good idea. One. Second, I think the kind of planning and participative processes you and I have been involved in are of two kinds. One is long term planning. So, should we have a museum in this plot of land? Or what do we do about traffic congestion? Or what do we do? So, that's the first kind. You have a few years to create a plan. So, you have literally no excuse not to consult with people. The second is a little more tricky, and that's the kind of work I have done for the past 20 to 30 years. There is a crisis, like the Hindu Muslim crisis, or in the garment sector, there is the question of sweatshops and labor rights and the women's rights of workers. It's a crisis, but it's not an immediate crisis. So you do have, say, a few months to bring together people and stakeholders and figure out how to come to some kind of an understanding. So everything depends on the context. So that's what I would say. What are some thoughts that you have on this?
So my thoughts are about other systems, right? If you're looking at alternatives to democratic processes or to decentralization, I believe, is essential even during a pandemic because we have a very heterogeneous society and we have an equally heterogeneous government, and both these the government has to respond to this heterogeneous society, and therefore there needs to be customized the forms of response from the government to the society. But what we resorted to in India, for instance, is policing, surveillance of behavior, whether people were wearing masks or not, and that also didn't yield results. We still had enormous amounts of death. So I'm really troubled about what can work. Cities such as Cuttack and Vizag, for instance, in India, have really responded very well to dealing with public health needs of the people, etc. But that's taken a lot of time, and there have been loss. There is enormous loss of life in that process, and it's grave repercussions of that delay. So I'm not sure what the answers. There are no quick answers to any of this, and it's still so that's troubling because the repercussions are very grave.
It is. And one of the things that I have learned over the past few years is not to romanticize democracy itself. It's really a system I prefer. And very often, it's not the most efficient system. That's the first thing. The second thing, I'm reminded of John Kenneth Galbraith's description of India as functioning anarchy. And I think here culture comes in. We have to recognize the importance of culture. And you talk of heterogeneity, but what we are really talking about is that every society has a different response to complying with norms and rules and laws.
Exactly.
Germany, for instance, is by and large, relative to many other societies, even the US and France, it's far more um, it's far more receptive to top-down instructions, directives from the government. Now, the US used to be fairly good, but the polarization in the country today has meant that one half of the country will comply, the other half will be against it. When the president changes or the government changes, it switches. So it's become dysfunctional in a very different way. India, on the other hand, is totally unique because Indians don't follow norms. Sorry, they follow traditional norms. Norms. They do not follow laws. Partly, and this is a larger conversation, so I'll just say that working in India and having worked in India for many years and watching what happens in India, not just through COVID, but pre COVID, it became very clear to me that Indians look at norms and rules and laws as essentially guidelines. They don't look at them as concrete, discrete directives. So, in other words, you have to stop at a traffic light. But so many of my people I know in India say, but if it's at midnight and there's a traffic light and there's nobody else, why should I stop? It's stupid. Now, if it's during peak hour, and yeah, it makes sense for me to stop at a traffic light. In other words, I use my discretion. All laws are meant to be, in India, at least in the public psyche, they are there to guide us, but only fools comply with it blindly. This means that, you know, how can, let's just assume that it was a very efficient, wise government, which it certainly is not. Okay, this government has made huge mistakes and is dysfunctional in a way that I've never seen Indian governments to be. But let's just assume, on the other hand, it knew what it was doing. Even then, half the country would not comply unless draconian measures were put into place and it was enforced. So when you talk about policing, when you talk about terrible things like police beating people on the streets, it's horrific. And there's something about the inability of the average Indian to comply with anything that they find inconvenient. That makes me believe that a country like India is at some levels ungovernable. Ungovernable. China used to be at one level like this, but communism really changed the culture over a 70-year period or 80-year period. Communism literally whipped the Chinese into shape in a way that democracy did not. Democracy, on top of our essential anarchic behaviors, gave us freedom to not just dissent, but do things. And it's almost a matter of pride for us to find loopholes, to bribe our way through, to avoid anything that might inconvenience us. So we have a problem in India, which is deeply rooted in the psyche of the people.
You know, I have other thoughts on that.
Please.
Um, I think religion plays a very important role in how we navigate our lives, and in Hinduism, for instance, um, which where the rules, since we were speaking about rules and the willingness of the uh, of of the diverse societies in India to sort of comply with formally established rules, but vis-a-vis community-led rules. Uh, Hinduism is known to be pluralistic in its dimensions. And this colleague of mine, Rajesh Ranganathan, who I was having a discussion with yesterday on this subject, actually was reflecting very and some interesting thoughts over there that um, um, in Hinduism, rules are situated. Rules for each of us. So we follow a rule based on where we are in that particular context. So the rule is very much rooted in context. And I think that is an important insight, and it's quite a counterpoint to the other interpretation of the way in which um, Hindus, for instance, may navigate rules,
Right.
where the dominant critique is that um, there is always an exception to the rule in the way the norms in the Hindu religion are structured, you know. So I think there are two very different perspectives there, and I think the argument on situatedness also speaks to the point you were raising about traffic signals and how we use discretion to conduct ourselves in a particular way because you're situated in that particular context and you're faced with a certain dynamic there, and you behave depending what that dynamic tells you is the best way to go about things. Or best for, it may not necessarily be the best for everyone, but it's the best for you at least, and a few others that matter to you, you know. So I think there's that question of individual behavior versus the society and what is good for one or the other.
You know,
And
you raised so many issues here, and obviously, one session between you and me here will not do justice to many of these threads that can do with picking. But one of the things that I kind of unhappily came to, one of the kind of realizations which I'm not happy about at all, is that perhaps democracy, liberal democracy, and the accoutrements of liberal democracy, including public participation, are very difficult to implement in a country like India. We haven't reached the place where we even have one idea of nationhood, the idea of a collective good. Every community has a slightly different idea of the collective good. For them, the good is what works for that community. And ever since, particularly with the caste system, but even without caste system, class or religion or whatever, we live in a society where it's morally it's morally necessary to take care of our own first, and almost to the exclusion of everyone else. So that means there is really no idea of nationhood, even though Gandhi and Nehru and that generation tried very hard to create an idea of nationhood. And this is what the Hindutva government today has been able to manipulate in order to create a different notion of nationhood based on creating the other, creating the internal enemy, which was certainly not the way I grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. We had a strong idea, but I realize now that idea was an urban, elitist idea of India as a nation. So, coming to democratic processes, how can you have a democracy when you do not have an idea of a collective good? One. Second, how can you even have a public dialogue process when people come there with one very different, for some people, shouting and yelling and silencing those who should not be at the table is necessary. They're not evil. They just do not understand how, for instance, a woman could be at the table. They can't understand how a Dalit could be at the table. Okay. And we are such a divided hierarchical society that to share a table with someone who is below us is absolutely inconceivable. So place at the table itself is contested. Okay. Second, way to communicate is contested. Third, you and I know that all participative processes require that the facilitator has power. In India, if you have a powerful business person or a politician or a landlord, he cannot understand why he is not the facilitator. He cannot understand the idea of having a outside third party neutral as a facilitator, because it's important for him or her to hold on to the reins, to hold on to the control that comes from process facilitation, process design and process facilitation. In the West, that's taken for granted. That, even if you're the CEO of a company or you're the senator of a particular state, if you come for a public participation, you defer to the process that was put in place by the facilitator or the facilitation team. Not so in India. So there are so many reasons why um, facilitative processes, participative processes, democracy itself is a very different ball game in India.
What are your thoughts?
And Julian, yeah, go on.
Look, I have a question that's brimming in my mind. I think that your thoughts take us to the question of the relationships between welfarist states and the society, right? Because if the premise on which we in India, for instance, the society is functioning, that you take care of yourselves first, that's because the state is not taking care of all of your basic needs, whether it's public health or it's your education, basic supply of water. We don't have water on a daily basis, and we know the levels of inequality. So doesn't that take us back to the question? Doesn't that take us to the question of the relationships between the nature of the government regime, the political form of the government regime, plus the welfarist agendas of that government regime, regardless of whether it is democratic or not, and the society, and how would that work for, say, Saudi Arabia, or for Singapore, or for France, or of course there'd be very different kinds of responses here because of the relations. Any thoughts on that?
This is one of the reasons why China and even countries like Singapore are very clear that democracy is not for them. They say that democracy breeds dissent and conflict, and it splits the country, whereas a far more autocratic, benign, they want it to be benign. Whether they are benign is another matter, but a benign, autocratic, almost elite government system where the best people come on top and decide how the country should be run is far more effective in a poorer society where people do not have the capacity or even the interest in thinking beyond their immediate needs. So that's the first thing. I think when we compare democracy in India to democracy in US or Netherlands or France, we're not doing justice to the situation because you cannot compare a subsistence economy with an affluent, higher developed economy. So that's the first thing. The second is that even in the developed democracies, if polarization increases or if the economy goes down, all bets are off. All bets are off. What we are seeing in the West today is that the West no longer has the economic and military primacy, you can call it hegemony, that it enjoyed all the way from 1945 to, say, 1980-85, particularly after the dot-com. Actually, you can trace it all the way back to the Arab oil embargo of 1972-73. That was the first time the West discovered it was totally dependent on other countries. Until then, as long as the West could sell and trade to its advantage, if you were General Motors or Mercedes Benz or Total in France, you had an uninterrupted demand in the developing world that you could dump your products or services. That isn't possible anymore. The wiping out of American manufacturing and transferring of that over the last 30 years to China and Mexico and to some extent India, that has hollowed out the US, hollowed out. So you have at one point an economy that isn't taking care of people the way it did 20 to 30 years ago. You have starvation, okay? And two, you have extraordinary polarization. So the US is reaching the same kind of dysfunctionality in terms of democracy as we've always experienced in India. So maybe the lesson for me, at least, is that democracy works only under normal temperature and pressure. In other words, if things are fairly even keel, then you can think in terms of the kind of public participatory processes you and I advocate. But if you don't, you can still have that. But is that going to help you or hinder you? I've been talking a lot. I want to keep quiet, Champaka. I'm wondering if you can share for the group specific challenges you've had in dealing with multiple stakeholders in any of your projects, the competing interests and ideas between government, maybe central government, state government, district or city government, and businesses and neighborhood committees. I cannot imagine anything more complicated. Please.
In fact, when you were speaking about how democracy would work only if the temperatures are normal, and I was thinking, is that the case in my Mumbai experience, for instance, when I was um, co-leading the development plan for Greater Mumbai in 2011, went on for about 4 to 5 years thereafter. And in that context, I think it's not a straightforward answer, right? Because here we are in a system where the government has outsourced the plan to a private company, and that outsourcing involves a contract which has public processes that are structured across 2 or 3 specific points in time. And the nature of engagement between the municipal government and the communities that are invited to the table is determined based on some flux and dynamic that goes along as you're evolving the plan. So it's not, none of that is written up in the laws, in the legislation so far in Maharashtra, for instance. Situate ourselves there. So the, the complexity is that, in a context like India, where um, people interact and they behave through norms that are culturally shaped and led. So that's the societal space, and there's so much diversity there. And we have the bureaucracy, for instance, here, the local government, which has its own hierarchies, but it is the people from the same society that work in that space of the local government. So it's a mix of a sort of, there are no clear boundaries there. It's not as clear as you could say. They're not binaries, right? So that system is complex. Plus, you have this private company which is functioning within a ring fence sort of a contract that doesn't seem to allow itself to participation, because private companies have a target to meet, they have a budget to comply with, and so you end up being not as open as a participatory process should actually be. Plus, there's so much. It's not an easy thing to, for any organization or set of individuals within an organization, to expose themselves. So for the government, municipal government, to expose itself completely, and then, so we're not used to that. Those processes are not established yet in consolidated ways, right? We've not. It's still a new process that we're experimenting with. There's been a lot of initiation from civil society organizations in India to institutionalize or to sort of formalize these participatory processes, but they don't do justice, because they're only touching the surface. It's just scratching the surface, So that's my experience when I speak, when I reflect on um, my experience from Mumbai, but in many other places as well. And interestingly, it is these processes which we've all struggled to sort of mainstream. And I'm using the word mainstream very deliberately, because I don't know to what extent mainstreaming makes sense in this kind of a process. And it actually has so many other, now, I mean, in this conversation also, and a couple of weeks that I've, months that I've been engaging with you on, I realize the contradictions there, between different. Perhaps it's a feudal societal arrangement and a feudal bureaucratic arrangement that is coming to terms with the need to imbibe democratic values. So it's not easy.
Comes back to the question of culture. And this is something that particularly the progressive left has violently reacted against. And I've been talking about the importance of culture for about 20 to 25 years, saying that no system can survive unless the culture within which you are trying to embed that system can either adapt itself to it or find a way to live with it. And the problem is some systems, like, I mean, take the idea of human rights. Human rights, or universal human rights, as we used to call it, and still call it, there is nothing universal about it. Yeah, you bring the charter and put it in a neighborhood of Mumbai, or in somewhere in China or in Africa or in Europe, and the ways in which people will respond to it is completely different. Okay, so that I have a question for you. Let's step away from large scale, complex participative processes. Can I ask you if you've ever been in any conversation with competing viewpoints where you have felt coming out of it that it has truly been a participative and satisfying experience. And,
Oh, for sure.
in which case, can you share what it is that might have allowed that conversation to be that useful?
So I have many examples from my own work. It's from my own work experience. One is, of course, in Mumbai, we had these series of workshops which the municipal corporation had initiated. It's a very brave municipal corporation there, actually. It's amazing. So we had a question about whether to open up the traditional settlements that Kolivada, it's called the Kolivada, so the Koli community. They've inhabited these settlements for generations, and it's their space. And the question was about whether to open those up for large scale urban regeneration. And there were just so many viewpoints. There were people who were from the heritage sector who had a certain kind of perspective about why Koli Vadas need to be preserved. The Real Estate Architects Association, which was present in the same around the same roundtable, they had thoughts on why it's important to allow for amalgamation of plots, for example, and allow for growth to occur. The Koli community itself said, no, thank you. We do not want to be imposed with any kind of preservation because we are an evolving community. And this lady who spoke up was absolutely brilliant, so loud and clear about what they think they would like to lead their lives like. It's their
Right.
settlements we're discussing. So, and it's so it was fantastic that experience. I thought it was wonderful because we finally, of course, went by what the Kohlis in our regulations, the way we imagine what should
So
happen
my
to these
question
spaces.
is, what
Yeah.
allowed it to be successful? Why didn't it collapse? Why didn't that conversation collapse?
I think there was an environment of openness that existed in that series of workshops that we'd organized, where it was actually the municipal corporation that was allowing for multiple perspectives to just be put out there on the table, and there were no concrete decisions taken at that moment.
So here's the thing. But firstly, I mean, I'm gratified to hear that even an exploratory conversation was so useful and so satisfying. That's wonderful. But I'm also wondering whether the nature of that conversation would have changed if decisions had to be made. It's when an agreement or a contract has to be signed, where compromises have to be made, that the rubber hits the road. And this is where in fact, I just had an idea talking with you. I don't know if you've met Merrick, who's old colleague of mine, and he was one of the first people. Actually, it's his conversation with me that launched MetaCulture Studio. He has been in consensus building for donkey's years. He knows everything about it. He works with Consensus Building Institute, a really fine organization out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I think it would be wonderful to have a conversation between the three of us. Let me moot it. I know I'm kind of taking him, unawares by talking about this in public, but I think it would be really interesting to get an expert who has worked in very difficult circumstances, even physically violent environments, and someone like you who understands both theoretically and practically what urban planning is at complex levels. And it'll be fascinating to have a second go at this conversation. But meanwhile, um, let me ask you. We talk of see, and here's where I'm coming from: public participation, consensus building, collaborative processes. All of these are premised on a democratic perspective. So, in other words, if we didn't think that ordinary people had a voice that was legitimate, that was valid, if we didn't feel that their needs needed to be taken into consideration, we wouldn't even be having these conversations. Planning vis a vis China, for instance, or the old Soviet Union. was totally top down. They didn't care because they felt they knew better. The people at the top knew better for whatever reason, either because of force, uh, punitive measures, or because the culture trusted hierarchical decision making, top down decision making. They got away with it. But this is not possible in democratic or wannabe democratic countries. So,
Yeah.
and we touched on culture. So, here's a question for you. You live in Bangalore, you grown up in India. When you look at your own life, and I'm asking a personal question, and you'll have to forgive me for that. When you look at your own life, growing up through college, early career, and now as a seasoned professional, married person, at where in your experience of Indian society have you felt the greatest, most democratically oriented functioning? Where, at what point in your life did you think you were part of a community or a group or anything that was truly participatory, where you were listened to, but you listened to others too, and compromises were made in the spirit of competing, I mean, negotiating between competing perspectives?
Very good question. I'm also reflecting on my day-to-day experience of being in Libya, and it was just before the war. Uh, in fact, this was in 2009, 10, and then 11. We were supposed to go back for some work, some more work on the projects we're working on, and essentially the to respond to your question about my experience of seeing that those that of seeing compromises being made in under circumstances where people have competing demands, right? I'll come to that point a little bit after, but I think the biggest reflection I'm having right now is my day-to-day experience of walking on the streets, being in an office space, going to grab a cup of coffee in your office, or in in normal day-to-day circumstances. In India, I don't have this tension that I'm constantly being watched by in through cameras, you know. And so there is a certain amount of um, there's no anxiety on that front. And I think that was the biggest distinction I found in terms of living and growing up in a democratic context,
As
and
compared to
as compared to living in countries or growing up in countries which do not are not governed by democratic governance regimes, right? So there are
where are you talking about?
um,
I'm guessing you're not talking of Netherlands, where you
no,
spend
no,
time, or
definitely
the
not.
US. Right.
No, no,
So,
certainly
which
not.
countries are you talking about, if you don't mind saying?
Not sure if I should be revealing specific names.
Okay.
There
Uh,
are governments that I've worked with briefly, but my experience in one of these countries was very severe, where we were constantly watched. Literally, you you could have been in doubt whether they were watching you, even when you're inside your own home spaces. You never know whether there's a camera up there. You know, so I
right.
think that's a very high level of vulnerability. Um, Certainly not face that in India. Absolutely not. We're far from it, I think. So even if we're speaking about, uh, how the current context in India, there's been so much discussion about this that there's loss of democratic experience in our day-to-day lives. I think we're far from this other experience that I had in this particular government regime. And to think about competing demands, I think just the fact that um, we have a system that is still governed by a constitution. And I'm not saying that the constitution is I'm certainly saying it's an evolving document. It's an evolving set of norms. It's an evolving set of processes, not a document. It's a process. So I think there are still all of those values, even though we might say that our communities are led largely by cultural norms. I think the fact that those processes do exist allow us to. It's sort of a. I think it's at certain points in time, whether it's particularly people in the neighborhood that I live in, and I engage with the Residents Welfare Association very closely here as well. So we rely on these on the rules, norms that are established, depending on what our needs are. It's not always the process that we mobilize, but it's sort of a convenient approach to relying on the rules when you need them, but relying on some other societal rules when those work for you better. So I'm not saying, I'm also very specifically saying that this convenience of relying on this formal and the informal ways of functioning then jeopardizes providing access to all, providing access across competing demands, competing communities. I'm not able to give a specific example, but I think let's say our own Residents Welfare Association, we have, it's not an organization which is led by a democratic process by itself. So, for example, there are no elected. We don't elect our community leader. So it is a person who is in her own right has taken on the leadership to uh, sort of deal with a lot of the local needs. But that doesn't mean, so since she's not elected, uh, it also means that she may or may not necessarily deal with all the um, all the demands of our ward. So I think there's this, so a lot of the decisions there get taken almost like it's a firm.
Mhm.
The Residents Welfare Association ends up working like a firm.
Almost like a phone,
So
right?
there's, yeah, it's
Yeah.
I think
The
competing demands negotiate these kinds of systems and
right,
how they are structured and how
right.
they work.
Right. So this is I'm really glad to hear your perspective here because it's not a common perspective today, Champaka, that anything in India is fair or just. And your example of your resident welfare associations is very interesting for me. Firstly, I'm glad it's working at some levels because I have mediated conflicts at RWAs, which have been so toxic. But I'm glad that yours is more functional. I'm also wondering whether part of the reason is because there's a greater level of equality between the members, as opposed to other systems where the discrepant or the disparities are so much more evident. I would imagine that. Um, Yes, I would imagine that if the inequalities were very high, this kind of functioning like a group, like a firm, maybe a little. It may be harder to make that happen. So it's just a thought. The second thing, as you mentioned, I really liked your example, even though you didn't very prudently and cautiously didn't want to give the name of the country. I can talk about mine. I have traveled and lived in the Arab states, and I can tell you, I have just walking on the park, in the park, or beautifully clean and lovely sidewalks. I have felt an incipient threat of being watched. And not just watched, that at any point I could be stopped and
Exactly.
questioned or even arrested for, it's the joke was if a local man hit your car from behind, you would get arrested. So I do get the point you're making, that in a country like India, by and large, people leave you alone on the streets in public spaces. That's not quite the situation for many women, for instance.
Exactly.
I know that many women are deeply threatened by the insecurities and harassment they face in public spaces in India. But that's, about gender. But your primary point is an important one. I'm also conscious of what's happening in the West now. London, for instance, is swamped with CCTV cameras. And and you know how I know this, even though the last time I was in England was, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, it's because of the crime shows that I watch in Netflix and everywhere else. The difference between a British crime show today and an American crime show is that the first thing the British detectives say when there's a crime is, let's look at all the CCTVs and we'll find the person who walked into that building and when they left. This is unsurpassed surveillance,
True.
almost communist country surveillance. And so, at one level, again, I look at this as that tipping point between operating at normal temperature and pressure, where you have affluence, you are secure, and by and large, you have a cohesive society. And when it becomes abnormal because you're no longer as wealthy, there's extraordinary inequality, economic inequality, and people are starting to fight against each other. And you have different perspectives of what a nation should be. That's when London starts resembling like China or Singapore. So, anyway, there's a lot here, but I'm also excited by the questions that are coming up. And so, let's start with the first question. I would like you to respond to Shiva's question, Champaka, because I think he's asking about cities. So, would you read it out and would you respond to the question, please?
Sure. Ashok, I just had one quick clarification on one of
Please,
the points that
please.
we were discussing earlier. I wasn't actually suggesting on the question of the RWA functioning like a firm. I was saying that's actually a problem, that it's not really
Um,
working as
no,
uh,
yeah,
as one would imagine it should. Just a
right.
quick point over there.
Thank you.
But let's
And yeah,
let's
just to add to that, I thank you for making the clarification. I don't think acting like a firm is always a bad idea.
It's not, but if there
It's
is
participative or democratic with the other stakeholders. Go on.
I was saying our ward, for instance, has quite a bit of diversity in terms of the economic, levels and the economic strata of people who occupy our different localities here. And in that kind of a context, to have the RWA function like a firm where representatives are very homogenous is not something that works
Yes,
well for
sir.
everyone. So that's
Thank you
coming
for clarifying.
on competing demands and how systems would address them or not. But coming back to Shiva's question, might cities replace countries as the primary unit of identity in the world? If so, what implications might this have on democratic processes? That's a very interesting question. There's quite a bit of theory on that as well, of course, but I'll refrain from getting into theory. Um, I think I think cities have, of course, been, after the liberalization of the world economy and the Indian economy as well, the cities have been seen as the engines of growth and power. And there are multiple perspectives there, of course. One dominant perspective, which is coming in again from the West, is that the whole planet has become urbanized. So if you're looking at the whole planet is, there's the context of planetary urbanization and the crisis of planetary urbanization, because the argument is that mines, for example, are catering to urbanization. Farmlands are catering to producing for urban environments. And similarly, ports, for example, are also catering to urbanity in one way or another. So if the whole planet is urban, the Amazon is getting depleted, and that process of depletion is being read as urbanization. So if all of it is urban, then I think there's a different question that sort of comes up, whether, and it's then we're going beyond boundaries of countries or city governments. I think becomes a much more grave question to think about.
That's fascinating. I never thought of it that way, Champaka. The idea of planetary urbanization, treating the rest of the planet purely as a resource for urban centers, which has been happening kind of organically, but if it becomes that cities become the governing centers, and each city is negotiating with another city, even within the same country, for resources. And only inside a city, and that within cities, between cities, you if even if you have a democratic system, it could be like your residents welfare associations, where the representatives are those who have control of those resources, whereas those who do not have access to the resources do not have power either, and are left out because their voices don't count. Fascinating. I love the connection between the RWAs and the cities. Uh, Great, thank you. And Shiva, if you want to add another question to this, to Champaka's response, please go ahead and do so. I'm going to take the next one from Raj Kumar Bhatt. If a pottery maker cannot mold his product, how effective is he? If democracy is not able to withstand the pressure, how do you address the cracks? Raj Kumar Bhatt, must you depress me so much? It's only Tuesday morning. But this is a great question. I think the acid test of any system is whether it works. And this is where idealism or even visionary against reality. The I have an example, a very sad example, but which explains or touches on what you're asking here. Tunisia. In the last 2 days, we have heard about the president of Tunisia sacking the prime minister, dissolving parliament, and taking on executive power. For those of you who've not been keeping up with it, Tunisia, coming out of the Arab Spring, was considered the only reasonable democracy coming out of the Arab Spring. Egypt collapsed, many of the others collapsed, even after much enthusiasm about the democratic activity in that region. Tunisia somehow held on to it. The What is most interesting for us today, right now, is to recognize why Tunisia is faltering or has faltered. It's because the government was not able to grow the economy even before COVID. COVID has almost completely destroyed the tourism industry, and the tensions between the Islamist group and the other groups, and the Islamist party is the largest party there, have been growing. As a result, ordinary people are on the streets demanding that the parliament be dissolved. In other words, it's the ordinary people who've lost faith in the democratic process. The potter's pots are not seen as worthy of being used, and they want something else. Now, mind you, they're not necessarily saying that we don't want democracy, but if you remove a democratically elected government, the chances of a replacement being more democratic is very unlikely. So, your point is a very good one, Raju. If the pot doesn't work, if the potter is unable to make useful pots that don't leak and don't poison us, people will find other ways to, other sources, even if it's a more tyrannical or despotic source. So thank you for that. Uh, Champaka, please take a look at the questions. And if there are any questions in particular you want to touch on.
There's one by Said Naeem who says, "What to do during a conflict in a democracy?" I think that's one for you, Ashok.
Right. Okay. So the way I see it, conflict resolution is fantastic in a conflict situation, provided, provided the affected parties are willing to engage in negotiation, willing to come to the table, and willing to have a mediator help them. So there are many ifs here. The problem with many conflict situations is that the parties are so certain of how right they are that they do not see any value at all in sitting across the table from the people they disagree with. What's happening between the conservatives, the Republicans in the US, and the left, particularly the progressives in the US, is a great example. It is absolutely devastating for democracy when people cannot even sit across the table to talk about issues. I'm reminded of something that Obama said during his presidency. And I think he was into his second term, and the student riots were going on about racism riots. And he was compelled to tell the students that it's one thing to protest, but when you protest and the other party comes to the table, you have to come to the table to talk with them. You can't continue to protest and demand that your needs be met without negotiation. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I mean, that was a wonderful cautionary statement. Nobody listened to him. He was attacked by progressives for even suggesting that protest has limits. And protest is useful in a democracy only if you follow it up with negotiation or dialogue. The problem with professional protesters, and I see the Indian NGO community, and I have no problem saying this because I have experienced firsthand the attitude of NGOs and activists in India. They are not interested in negotiation and dialogue. They see that as selling out. Their idea of democracy is the right to protest and bully the government and business into giving them what they need. I'm not questioning whether the NGOs want good things. An environmental NGO wants to make sure the river is not polluted. Uh, um, a group working with indigenous tribes wants to ensure that their land is not taken away. These are very important things to activate, to advocate for, and to protest about. But protest in a democracy only works if you are able to, as I said, follow it up by coming to the table and saying, okay, here are our needs. Tell me why this is difficult. Tell me what you need. Can we talk about this? But in India, and my 12 years of work as a conflict resolution professional in India made it apparent to me that the people who resisted the most in terms of the work we do were NGOs. And these are good people. They're not terrible people. They are people where their hearts are in the right place, but they do not understand democracy. They think human rights means that a minority person or someone who's marginalized must get their way. It doesn't work that way in a democracy. The default is that the majority or the dominant groups will set the stage, but a minority person or a marginalized group has the right to question it, to dissent, and to ask for consideration, and to even protest. But that protest can go nowhere unless you are able to transform it into dialogue. So it's just very interesting for me, Saeed, that conflict is something that democracies are equipped to deal with, provided the parties in a conflict want to deal with it in a democratic way as opposed to a top down way. If let's just say I'm a minority and I put my foot down and I say this is the only way it will happen, and I'm able to shut down the city through strikes, or I'm able to do whatever to bring down, to get a decision on my behalf. Guess what? I set the stage for the destruction of democracy. Next time round, the people at the top know that Ashok will not reason, he will not negotiate. He is absolutely adamant. They will not see any reason in dialogue. And this is part of the reason why we are in this situation in India. And This is part of the reason why the US is starting to put itself in a very, very difficult situation. I just want to give this little thing that I picked up in the New York Times today. A question and an article about, and this is the question: should I fire my dog walker because of her political views? I'm astounded. If my dog walker, firstly, there are such things as dog walkers. If my dog walker cannot have views that are different from mine, how will I tolerate that in, from someone who I have a greater stake in cooperating with? How will I tolerate it from my spouse or my friends or my co-workers? It's a terrifying situation in the US today. What are some thoughts that you have, Champaka?
Yeah, I have some important thoughts, I believe. There are new types of networks. I wouldn't call them NGOs or non government organizations as such, but more recently, there are many new networks that have evolved over time, like over the last 4 to 5 years, where there are a couple of leaders, of course, in these networks, but they have very proactively taken the position that they are going to engage and reach out to the government. They're going to reach out to all other types of organizations, groups of people, etc. It doesn't have to be, and it's very agile. These networks are much more agile than what we've had in the past. And I think new types of systems and groups, networks are emerging, which um, may not, they do not fall within the traditional sort of an understanding of the NGOs.
Advocacy groups. Right,
Yes, so
right.
I think it's interesting to observe that, and I do know some of these community leaders or these network leaders personally as well, and I'm looking forward to how they evolve. Actually, I'm very keenly observing what forms of engagement they take up. Because I know, for example, there's this group called Heritage Beko in the city of Bangalore, where they've very proactively taken up positive forms of discussion with the different levels of the government,
Parties.
with firms, with different types of communities. It's not a protest-led form of
Mm. I
engagement.
love it.
So it's very interesting. I'm just curiously watching what's coming up,
Right, right.
and I'm part of some of these as well. So it's not just that I'm speaking from a distance, not at all.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. I'm really glad to hear that, Champaka. And I really hope to see that grow. I do have a concern, and I'm just putting it out there, that this is coming a little too late because, and your views may be different from mine, but I firmly believe that the democratic ship in India has sailed. I personally believe that this particular government is not going to be receptive to that kind of negotiation or dialogue anymore. I do believe it's possible with local governments and with some businesses, but when I look at the big businesses like Reliance or Adnani, I don't see them as even remotely being interested in any process of this kind. Whereas 10 years ago, they could have been compelled to come to the negotiating table. And my experience on issues of, say, for instance, GMO foods, on in mining and many others, where the NGOs refused to come to the table. So that was a point 10, 15 years ago that democracy could still have perhaps been saved. But I believe that, particularly in the last 7 years after the first coming of this government, and even more so in the last 3 to 4 years, I think one would have to be an extraordinary optimist to believe that the collapse or the weakening of democracy can be rolled back. But having said that, better late than never. If there are people who are recognizing the importance of thinking beyond protest, I think it would be great. But it's not just India, as I said, throughout. France is a great example. It's other than the US, where the the capacity to genuinely sit down and engage, which is the hallmark of democracy, without dialogue, without negotiation, without compromise, you do not have a democracy. Elections don't make a democracy. Elections can be very top down, and it can end up with majoritarianism, as in Orban's Hungary or in Poland, and definitely in India, Modi's India. So I think it's to be seen, and people like us who are committed to these processes, we can only hope that somehow things are not as bad as they seem to be. So,
No, I think, yeah,
yeah, thoughts
I
from
couldn't
you, particularly at
agree
any
more.
level. What are you going to do with your career right now? You're a newly minted PhD, and you're passionate and you're really bright and all this. And in this world, what are you aching to do?
So one big question is whether one should look at what happens in the future in my life as part of a career. I think I'm questioning the word career, and I don't think I'm attached to the word career anymore. I'm trying to look at what gives me a good sense of satisfaction. So there again, I go back to 1993. I break away from any predetermined boxes around me. So that actually makes it much more difficult for me to sort of think about what I want to do next. But I do want to say that I'm part of a network which is working towards working with different types of organizations to see how we can transition into a new type of new understanding of, and I work with cities largely, unless that changes over a period of time, which I'm very open to as well. But um, basically working with organizations to see how we can all evolve into something more, into embracing something more inclusionary, and going to pull myself out of my disciplinary boxes also, and to see how we can work with organizations to sort of help them evolve, and I will learn from the organization, and the organization will probably work with a group of us. I'm hoping that that's going to take off sometime
Wonderful.
soon.
I wish you all the very best, genuinely. And I do believe that there is some wisdom in looking at this moment of crisis in a slightly optimistic way. And I mean that in a very narrow sense, that perhaps the ruining of our illusions, the crushing of our 1960s and 70s fueled dreams allows us to rethink systems, rethink the ways in which we will intervene in our environment, and rethink the ways in which we will engage with each other, so that when there is an opportunity to come out of this morass, we can ensure that we don't make the same mistakes again as we made for the last 50 to 70 years. So, initiatives like yours, I think, may be the nascent efforts at almost rebuilding civilization. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Really, I hope this conversation was useful enough for you. And I would like to have you back and make you a veteran of these sessions. But, I think there are ways we need to explore many of these issues, because I think they are at the core of your interests and mine.
absolutely. Thank you very much, Ashok, for inviting me. This has been so fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Look
Thank
forward
you.
to more. Thank you.
Take care. So, here we are. Back again, we have finished our next session, or rather, the latest studio conversation. And I am trying to find ways to engage with sincere thinkers. Most of the people who get invited to these conversations are people who've taken my courses. That's Demo Sapien courses in democracy or critical thinking or pluralism. And so, on that In that On that note, I want to just invite those of you who are with us and who see this video to join our diversity and pluralism course, which is starting on August 21st. This is happening on 12 consecutive Saturdays. It will happen between 10 a.m. And 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which will be 7:30 p.m. in India. And it is, I think, relatively convenient even in Europe and other parts of the world. Uh, I think you will find that this course is very different from any other approach towards diversity you have ever encountered. I call it for the perplexed pluralist. This is not diversity for the sake of diversity. This is diversity with the active intention of creating sustainable, humane, pluralistic societies. In other words, it's how do we coexist with each other, not just how do we fight with each other in order to get what my group wants, which is what diversity has actually ended up as competing victimhoods. I am more oppressed than you are, therefore I need more. The metaculture approach will be very different. Do try to join us. And um, otherwise, thank you very much. Stay safe and keep thinking and talking with those who are sincere enough to listen and speak and learn. Thank you very much, everyone.